for joining us today. My name is Fiona Hanlon. I'm the Events and Communications Executive at Compliance Institute. So thank you for joining our session, led by our D&I committee on understanding neurodiversity for awareness to action. So just a bit of housekeeping before I hand you over. So the session will run for approximately 1 hour. We will leave time at the end for Q&A, so we do encourage our attendees to submit your questions and they'll be addressed at the end. So this is a discussion format, so there'll be no slides presented today, but I will send CPD code 2025-2213 to all attendees once the session concludes. And it will also be recorded and that will be available in the library section of compliance.ie later on today. So I'll hand you over now today to our moderator, who's a member of our Compliance Institute D&I committee, Davidas Chaglakas. Probably didn't pronounce that right, Davidas, my apologies.
No, perfect, Fiona. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar today. As Fiona mentioned, Understanding Neurodiversity from Awareness to Action. I'm Davidas Chaglakas. I'm a member of the Compliance Institute's D&I committee and will be moderating today's session with Aurelia. So as previously mentioned by Fiona, if you would like to ask any questions, please do so through the questions section on the right of your screen. And hopefully we'll have time at the end to get through some of the questions. And now I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Aurelia Deflan, who will lead our conversation today. So before we jump straight in, I would like to hand you over to Aurelia, who will start by telling us a little bit about yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone who's watching. So my name is Aurelia. I am currently the neurodiversity lead for Google in Ireland. I'm also a neurodiversity coach, executive and career coach as well. And I work with the University of Cambridge as a policy fellow on topics of disability inclusion. I am autistic myself, and I'm very happy to be here today having a conversation around understanding neurodiversity. And I hope this is going to be of interest to all of you. Thank you so much, Davidas.
Thank you, Aurelia. So it's great to have you with us. We have a bit to cover, so I'd like to dive straight in. So I guess to start off, I'll just say for personally for myself, for quite a while, I wasn't entirely sure what neurodiversity actually meant in practice. I'd hear the term being used, being thrown around, but it wasn't always clear what exactly it covered. So through conversations like this and my own research, I've started to really appreciate how wide and important this topic is. So I'm really curious to hear your perspective. And I guess to start us off, could you tell us what is the neurodiversity movement today and how come we are hearing more about it now?
I think it's important that we cover the basis, what even are we talking about? And I want to tell you and our audience, look, this has been a moving target for the last 10 years. So first of all, we should start in 2012. So 2012, 2013, the diagnostics criteria were actually changed, right, for autism and ADHD. And this was the catalyst for the change that we see today, right? Because 10 years or so ago, the manual was changed, and so new psychologists or psychiatrists that came into practice like 5-6 years ago are starting to implement that change. And now we are seeing all these late diagnosed, folks oftentimes being diagnosed through their children, right? So their kids are autistic, have ADHD, etc., and they go through the diagnostics process themselves. So this is why we hear so much more about it now. We used to think that 10 years ago, like the autism prevalence was around 1%. Right now, we think that it's close to 3.5%. This is a number from Ireland, actually. So people who are, autistic, ADHD, etc., have always been here, of course. But because the diagnostics criteria were changed to reflect all of the different ways that these traits and attributes and neurotypes can express themselves, we now have a broader understanding. And so when we talk about neurodiversity, we usually talk about, of course, there's autism and ADHD, but you also have dyslexia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and also other types of attributes or neurotypes like bipolar, schizophrenia, So all of these different ways of seeing the world and thinking that are just slightly maybe different than others. But this is quite a broad umbrella right now. And there's also new research that came out recently that states that around 40% of newer generations, so Gen Z, Gen Alpha, that are considering themselves to be neurodivergent. So this is going to become even more prevalent in all of the conversations that we're having, right? So language is going to, of course, shape what we're talking about, but it's important that we use the terms that are really empowering and affirming for these communities, if that makes sense.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. And so there's a sort of a social and a medical model when it comes to talking about neurodiversity, isn't there? Could you just touch a bit on that, please, if you don't mind?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way forward as well. So when we talk about these attributes and traits, and I think some of you may have noticed already that I'm really making a point of staying away from words like conditions or illnesses. You know, those are really pathologizing terms that we call the medical model. So of course, when you are diagnosed, you're going to be judged based on criteria that are like deficit in XYZ or is displaying X or Y traits. And this is very deficit based, you know. And like I said earlier, I'm autistic. And if you consistently tell me that I have deficits or that I'm not doing as well as other people in certain areas, of course, it's not going to make me feel great, right? So that's why we want to try and stay away from the type of medicalized language that is used oftentimes towards something called the social model of disability. And to explain this concept clearly, I'll take myself as an example. So the medical model states that I have inherent deficits, right? So I'm not able to do things because of the way that I am, you know, being autistic. And the social model states that it is the environment that is disabling me. It's not me inherently. So if I work from home, I'm able to work, you know, from 9 to 5. I have no issues at all. Everything is great. If you put me in an office, I can maybe do 20 minutes of work because the sensory sensitivities are going to be too difficult for me to handle. There's just too much noise and it's very overwhelming. So where is the problem coming from? You know, is it coming from me or is it coming from the environment? So this is really something that we want people to think about when they think about disability inclusion, right? There are several things that you can change in order to accommodate people, but they're not inherently, you know, deficient in something, right?
That's great. Thank you so much. So I think it's such a powerful reframing, right? That one might potentially need to go through and if you go through that reframing in terms of social versus medical, for example, it makes inclusion feel more achievable. Would that be a correct way of putting it? It would be more achievable if you look at it from that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I look at myself and I say, you know, I'm autistic or I have ADHD, it's not something I can change, right? So obviously it's inherent to me. And the way we want to approach this and say, look, what can I do to really empower you? Some changes are going to be environmental, some changes are going to be, of course, legal and compliance, which we're going to talk about later. But there are ways to accommodate people, ask them the right question, and make sure that the environment around them really works for them. And it all starts with potentially, you know, a different attitude when you look at disability. And we want to really challenge the pathologizing narrative, right? That people can only struggle or that they, you know, they can't help themselves, or, you know, we want to move from that, right? And there is a movement that takes on this attitude, which is, you know, neuroaffirmative practices, where we say, you know, you are the way that you are. How can we make the environment work? We can probably, you know, adapt, accommodate, and then move along together, which also plays on the principle of the curb cut effect, which many of you will have heard of. You know, when you cut like a curb for example, a trolley or, you know, a buggy, for example, you know, people who are in wheelchairs can also use it. So this is kind of the same principle, where if you make accommodations to start with for people who might have this type of neurotypes, it can work for all other types of people, actually.
Okay, so I think I like that's really powerful, and I think it's a good reminder that people working within compliance will sometimes hear, you know, other departments or functions say, oh, compliance is for the compliance function. They're responsible for it, where in fact it's everyone's responsibility within the organization. So I think accessibility likewise is everyone's responsibility, right? It's not just HR, it's not just compliance, it's everyone is responsible for accessibility. So building on that, once we understand these definitions, which you have done a great job in providing more information on for us, and how the thinking has shifted, the next big question is, so how do we move from awareness into real everyday action within the organization? What should organizations be mindful of when they're considering on how to approach neuro inclusivity, Aurelia?
Great question. And, you know, once we have a better understanding, we want to move to action, and that's perfectly understandable. So one thing that we need to be mindful of, you know, as a group of people working in different functions as well, being disabled or not, is that what we're talking about is a massive group of people with oftentimes competing desires or needs, right? So we cannot solve for one thing, like that's simply impossible. So the key word is going to be flexibility in everything that we do. Like the enemy of inclusion is really going to be rigidity in everything. Which, of course, I understand that talking about flexibility and compliance is not really like something you'd think will go well, you know, hand in hand. But there are ways we can approach this to make it more, you know, more flexible, just overall, right? There are different things to consider. So it's always going to be a multifactorial approach, like you pointed out very relevantly. It's like it's everyone's business, right? Accessibility and inclusion. So we look at environmental factors. So I already talked about that briefly. What can I change in the environment in order to be more accommodating? So again, you know, you can ask the users of your office, you know, people who are here, and say, you know, what do you need from this office to be able to work better? We can talk about working from home. For this, I would invite you to look at the European Commission guidance actually on the accommodations. We're going to talk about this a bit later on, but there is just great guidance. So you don't have to, you know, reinvent the wheel, basically. There are people who are working on this. We talk about legal and compliance. So this is an aspect where, yes, we talk about inclusivity and accessibility, but we also talk about risk, right? When we talk about legal and compliance, how do we handle medical data, for example, like that's special category personal data, people don't have to disclose, etc. So this is something we can cover a little bit later as well. There's the retention and the business outcomes that we're looking to cover. So how do we make sure that once we hire people who are, you know, neurodivergent, we can actually keep them? And the type of outcomes that we want to achieve for the business, how can they work with the people that we have and we can leverage their strengths? There is a reputational aspect as well. So this is truer if your company is larger, obviously, but being an inclusive employer, you know, is something that you have to show up and do every day. You can't just say, oh, I'm, you know, inclusive and I have accessibility. It's something that you have to do. Otherwise, people might leave, and you know you might not be hired able to hire the same type of talents once again. And there's scalability and sustainability. So again, we can talk a little bit about that later on. But when you create processes and you think about what's going to work for your company, think about scaling. So you can do this for one person, sounds great. Can you do this for 70 other people? You know, both in cost and in time and in implementation. So there are a lot of different factors that you should cover, which means that everyone in the organization should really be involved in their own function as well.
Well, though that's amazing. That's a lot of valuable information and points there. So if I unpack that a little bit, like what first steps would you advise an employer to make the workplace more accessible? What first steps could they take? And hopefully they've already taken those steps. For those that might not have, what would your advice be, Aurelia?
Yeah. And I mean, look, we can talk ad nauseam until, you know, who we're talking about and all the different groups. But again, if we look at the nitty gritty and what we have to do, there are things that you today can start, you know, looking at right now. So one of the biggest pain points that I have seen in different companies is the accommodations process. So this is one of the single biggest point of failure in all of the companies that, you know, I've spoken with, I've worked with, etc. I myself had to use the accommodation process many times in my life, and it is again the single biggest point of failure. when an employee is disclosing a disability, the employer has a reasonable duty to accommodate. So obviously the law states that basically, of course, the employer cannot ask for disclosure, but there are two cases. One is that they become aware because the employee is telling them, look, I have a disability, I'm autistic, I have ADHD, etc. Or they become reasonably aware, which is also a case in the law where they have become aware, basically, and then they have to engage with that information as well. I would like to invite you to look at the Employment Equality Act in Ireland, which is the text of reference that covers all this legislation. But basically, once I've told you, oh, I need accommodations because I have a disability, you have a duty to engage. If you do not engage with this information or offer me proactive support in some way, then this is like an undue delay, and it's considered a form of indirect discrimination. So already we are in a bit of hot water, with the legal and compliance risk, right? So it's important that you as an employer is proactive in order to engage with this information. So just have a look at the accommodations process. Ask one person, that is willing to maybe give you some information inside your company if they've gone through it. But look at it, do you require your employees to go through occupational health? Who is your provider? How do they evaluate the type of accommodation that is being requested? What kind of recommendation do you take from them? Do you have in-house HR folks who are also looking at this? So the most common ways that these companies would do this is that they would ask the employee to go through the occupational health. Occupational health is okay, I think that we can say that you can work from home, for example, or you need also noise cancelling headphones. And then the employer is what else do you need? And the employee is I don't know, what can you help me with? And then they are stuck in an infinite loop. And this conversation never is resolved, basically. So again, single biggest point of failure in companies that people can work on, if that makes sense. This is really the place where you should get started.
Okay, brilliant. That's some very practical advice there. Thank you so much. So, and that ties perfectly into the practical side of things, right? So once we're aware of these considerations, what would be some effective tools or strategies that you've seen that help support neurodivergent employees in their day-to-day?
Yeah, I'll give you a use case as well, because I would want folks watching this webinar to also leave having some practical guidance on what they can look at today. So we talked about the accommodations process. Again, there are a few pitfalls that you should really be aware of. For example, a common pitfall is that the HR department is going to want to be proactive by potentially offering forms of accommodations or saying we need more information, or saying, I think maybe you could do X and Y and Z. I would really advise against all of this. HR professionals should not be making decisions around, medical accommodations for employees. This is unfortunately something I see happen a lot because people would love to help. Usually it's really good intentions, but it's not the place of HR. This is actually a massive legal risk that they should not be commenting on anything that has to do with medical accommodations. Because again, we're not talking about preference. We're talking about something that is a protected characteristic under the law. So we really should be mindful of the advice that we give people once we become aware of their disability. If you do not know and you do not have the resources in-house, so for example, if you don't have an employee resource group, which is often a group of people who might be neurodivergent themselves that can advise you on how to move forward and help support someone with a neurodivergent traits or neurotype, you should outsource this knowledge to a neurodivergent consultancy or something like this. I would really advise against getting into too deep with your HR department, for example. So that's one thing. And then the first thing I want to talk about that I've just mentioned earlier is please rely on existing guidance. Look at the European Commission's website that has updated guidance as of last year, actually 2024. They put out a new guide on reasonable accommodations in the EU. The first one is actually that they added work from home as a common accommodation. I know it is a bit of a point of contention, but just for folks watching in terms of legality and compliance, what the law says is that you should provide a reasonable accommodation to an employee that is disabled. And the problem is the word reasonable. What does reasonable mean? So in the context of, the law, it's basically that what is reasonable for a company of 3 people is not going to be the same as for Google. Like if I ask for a 75,000 euro share and it's a 2 people business, it's going to be super hard, and it's actually can be considered unreasonable because they simply don't have the resources. So this is where the goalpost is, right? So, and something to remember is that it's on the business to provide proof that this is undue hardship. It's not the disabled person to say, oh, I'm going to prove to you this is reasonable. It's the other way around. So we should really be mindful of this, that if you tell an employee, oh, I cannot give you XYZ, it's you as the business who will have to say, look, this is undue hardship and this is why. So we have to be really mindful of this. So just have a look at the European Commission's guidance on this. Again, you should also rely on people within your business who maybe are neurodivergent and can potentially give you some guidance on this. Again, this would be more informal. But something to consider is that flexibility, as I've said earlier, is going to be the keyword. And try to give flexibility into how people operate. So it's not really about flexibility around the outcomes or the KPIs that we're looking for. Like, you don't have to change an entire job for someone to be accommodated, but you can give more time to people to process information, for example, having them request notes in writing, having the camera off during meetings, having hours that work for them. If you have ADHD, for example, it's quite common that you might want to work from, 7 to 11 and then 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. If your business allows for that, you should really say, okay, of course, like that works, that's fine. So again, I would invite, people watching to just think what flexibility can mean for your business and how you can still have the same business outcomes that you'd like, but when the execution can just maybe look a little bit different.
Okay. Thank you. So those are very helpful reminders on some very good points that you've raised. And I think what kind of sticks with me there is that when it comes to flexibility, it doesn't always mean big structural changes, does it? It can mean simpler things that can be put in place.
Absolutely.
Okay.
One of the questions that comes back often is, how can I support neurodivergent workers? If I had the answer, I would be very rich and it would be great, but it's not possible, right? So neurodivergent folks is just a very diverse group of people. Exactly like you take any community, any group of people, there are as many people as there are, differences. So you cannot accommodate the group. So that's why it's important to just go and ask the person, look, what do you think I can help with? Right? Then you see what they tell you. If they say, oh, I would prefer to work from home, oh, I would prefer to have a different lamp, or something like this. One thing that needs to change most is actually people's just attitude, right, to these kinds of requests. If I tell you as as an employee and I say, I need to work from home, I can assure you I'll do better work, your reaction ideally is not going to be, oh, I'm very suspicious of this. I think this person is trying to cheat the system or something like this. It should be like, okay, look, we'll try it out, of course, and then we see if it makes you like more sustainably work, essentially. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that's been one of the biggest point of contention again is more like the adversarial nature of the process. It should not be adversarial. It shouldn't be, oh, I need something from my employer, so I'm going to have to fight for it and it's going to be difficult and I have to advocate for myself, which can be already super difficult. Like if my bandwidth is very reduced because I'm already quite burned out from being disabled in the workplace is really difficult to start with. I won't have the energy to advocate for myself potentially, and I might just go on sick leave, or even disability leave, or just leave the company entirely. And this usually can be prevented by simply saying, okay, here is the space for you to tell us what you need. Let's find a way forward together.
Right. Okay, thank you. And then staying on the subject of tools and strategies, what would you say is often an overlooked but incredibly useful tool, perhaps?
So there are a few things, like obviously, again, like the attitude, I think is interesting because people's attitude is a tool that they don't use, like ironically, because when people come to me and say like, yeah, what tools can I use? You don't need more tools. Like I show you, you have all the tools you need. You don't need more. You know, like just look at the guidance and have a conversation with the person. Another tool that is often underused but also underutilized is actually, like I mentioned, the ERGs, right? So the Employee Resource Group. So I'll give you the example, of course, of Google, like the Employee Resource Group called the Disability Alliance, which is a group that represents and advocates for the need of disabled employees, right? And we have a neurodiversity offshoot simply because we have many requests from neurodivergent folks, and also, for example, parents of neurodivergent children. Again, like there's different groups that can be sort of affected by this in different ways. So we should really just listen to people with lived experience. It's probably the most underutilized resource that you have already at your disposal. The tools are there. Again, just ask people with lived experience and try to just have an open mind when you think about this. I've seen many successful companies that actually don't ask for any justification, for example, from their employees. Like you don't need to give your diagnostics paperwork, just to request accommodation, because that's a choice that the employer makes as well. And imagine putting yourself in the position where you have a disability, and this is a private piece of information. You know, I don't necessarily want my employer to have my medical data, and then I'm being asked to prove that I'm disabled enough, you know, to be able to work from home or have this different laptop, you know, or something like this. Like this is already setting the stage for a really confrontational conversation or adversarial relationship. And this is where a lot of the time this goes wrong. So again, the way you approach this is going to be your best resource, and it's really often overlooked.
Brilliant. And if I can stay on that for a little bit, so we're discussing conversations that, you know, might be going on between managers and employees. So and I'm sure we have quite a lot of managers, for example, and leaders on the call. So like, how would they approach the conversations without necessarily overstepping, or what would your advice be?
Yeah, this is a difficult conversation and topic, because of course it's not your job if you're a manager or again HR. It's not, first of all, you're not supposed to know everything. So I want to also say that to people on the call who may be thinking, oh, I'm not equipped to have this conversation, I don't know how to address this. That's normal, you know, you're not supposed to, unless you're a trained professional, like you're a counselor or a psychologist. Like there's no way you'd know exactly how to have this conversation. Don't beat yourself up, you know. Again, it's more a question of attitude than anything else. And the second point I want to make is that, again, stay away from recommendations, making, you know, giving advice to people. If you yourself are not neurodivergent, you should stay away from this. You know, it's not your position, it's not your job, and it's not really what people usually expect as well. So there's going to be difficult moments where potentially you suspect that an employee might be neurodivergent, but they won't talk to you about it. Like that's often the case because they just don't want to disclose because of X, Y reasons. Sometimes they're not even diagnosed themselves. So it's very unclear. What I would do in this situation, which is the most complex, is just to tell the employee, look, maybe it seems like you are struggling with X, Y, Z. You can go and talk to, you know, the coaching resources that we have, or the ERG, like the Employee Resource Group. If you have none of that, I think it would be best to establish what the employee is struggling with specifically, and then try and help them to see if it works. Like again, because if this relates to performance, it's going to be difficult to have a conversation around this specifically. We have to be very mindful that there are, again, pitfalls in performance reviews that relate to indirect discrimination. So if you tell an employee that they're constantly, for example, not prioritizing correctly, or that, you know, they don't deliver on time and they have ADHD, like this can be associated with indirect discrimination again. So we have to be mindful of this. But anyway, to answer your question, it's not really your job as a manager to have these conversations. So I would give the resource to the person to try and see if they can get help from, you know, coaching resources, or even a therapeutic setting, if that is something that your company offers as well, like counseling support or EAP. But what I would do is not just pass the buck, you know, is also to check in on this person regularly and say, okay, I'll get back to you in a month with this, and we'll see where we are if you still need support. And if you see that this person is consistently struggling and you don't have the information to help them, again, I would outsource this to someone with more counseling experience.
Brilliant. Okay, so even with all these, the useful points and tips and advice that you've mentioned, there are still some invisible barriers that can impede organizations, often without them perhaps realizing it, right? So maybe I would like to explore that a little bit. So many barriers to inclusion are invisible. So what outdated practices should we be challenging? What common policies or processes might unintentionally exclude neurodivergent employees from your experience and your knowledge?
Yeah, look, I don't think this is a very controversial point, but return to office is completely exclusionary. Look, I understand the point behind this in some cases, but it just doesn't work for a lot of people for various reasons. But I'm not going to have an ethical debate here, but if we talk about, disability specifically, if I were to work in an office, which I did before COVID, because I wasn't diagnosed, I would have burnouts every year, every couple of years. I would be off work for 2 months, and that's my life now, basically. So it's just, and now I haven't had one for a long time. So the point is that this creates sustainable environments for people. And if you can create the environment where people thrive, working remotely, like that's definitely a thing. We've seen that obviously during COVID, and there's big case for this. So the fact that if you have an inflexible policy around this is going to be quite damaging. I know this is one of the big ones, so I just want to make that clear that this is complicated for a lot of people. So I'm not even talking about people who are carers or things like this, because they are also affected by these policies. But if you have a hidden disability, it's just going to be harder not to work from home, essentially. So other types of inflexible policies can be like performance reviews. So like we evaluate people based on a very specific set of criteria, and then never changing them, never adapting them. Again, I'm not talking about business outcomes. I'm talking about just criteria for evaluation. So more like how people think instead of what they do. I would really invite people to look at the difference between the two, so the deliverables and the KPIs, right? And look at other types of policies. Like I'll give you an example. Like a lot of the meetings I used to attend were like always in person. And I can't do that. Like, to me, this is inaccessible because I would have to go to the office. And if I go to the office, I'm so distracted by the amount of people in the meeting that I can't actually grasp, the concepts that are being shared. And then I have to go home and lay down for 2 hours. So it's completely counterproductive, and I haven't gained anything. So, accessible meeting spaces, or again, being present in the office is a big one. You can also have a look at other things like team building things, or how you structure your teams, how people share information in meetings as well. That can be a big barrier. Again, I could give you 1,000 examples. The best thing is look at the different policies and ask someone with lived experience, autistic or ADHD or other neurotypes, what they think about the accessibility of these policies. This will be your best resource, and they will immediately point out potentially ways you can improve on those basically as well. And the last point I want to make is that when neurodivergent employees fail to work within the constraint of a business, if it is very inflexible, they can often be put on PIP, for example, so performance improvement plans, so what we refer to as corrective measures. Usually these do not work at all. Like I have empirical data that 80% of the time people end up leaving the company because they simply cannot comply with the way that things are done, even if they try really hard. So I would also encourage you to look at different avenues instead of seeking correction. Again, coaching is a really, really good outlet for people who are neurodivergent. If they, you can't give them access to a therapeutic setting potentially. Mentoring is another one if they're maybe a bit younger as well. But again, look more at a collaborative approach instead of a corrective one is always going to be more successful.
I really liked what you said about, measuring how people work rather than what they achieve is probably not the best way of looking at it. And also the PIPs. I've heard of PIPs throughout my experience as well. People, certain people being on PIPs or whatever. But looking at it from a neuro inclusivity point of view, I haven't really thought about it from that angle. So thank you for sharing that. And then I guess this ties perfectly to my next question. So what role can HR and compliance play in identifying and addressing some of these invisible barriers then, Aurelia?
Yeah, so we talked earlier about auditing the accommodations process. So again, look at, who is involved, like how are they doing things? Because again, you have to imagine that I've already, for example, if I ask for an accommodation, I've had to send my medical data to someone. I've had to disclose a ton of information about me. Then I had to ask for help. Then maybe I didn't get it. And, it's already very tiring. So let's say that we're an HR professional, legal compliance professional. We've audited this. So do that for performance reviews as well. So I've just mentioned this already a little bit, but neurodivergent employees are most likely to be negatively affected by that. So again, if I look at different, jobs, and some of the requirements would be communication skills, and you tell me, oh, you need to improve on your communication skills. I, as an autistic person, will not understand what you're talking about, genuinely, because it is such a broad concept to me. This is something I've had to learn. It's not something that's instinctively has come to me. And so if you tell me, oh, you need to improve your communication skills, I'll be like, okay, how, where and with whom? So if you do performance reviews that relates to, softer skills, let's say soft skills as a bucket, you need to be a lot more detailed and a lot more specific in what you're seeking from your employee in that sense. So if you say, oh, you need to improve your communication skills because, for example, you deliver the meeting notes, later than other people, you have to go into more details. So just look at your performance review process, overall, what are the usual outcomes? What do you see in terms of numbers? Do people who have bad reviews, for example, 1 year do better the next? Again, I would encourage you to have a look closer at what this means for people within your company as well, and how it changes trajectory potentially. And you can also look at frameworks that you're using simply to evaluate people. It's not enough to just say, black and white or fair paths and say, oh, you're doing well, you're not doing well. You have to go into more coaching frameworks, which are always more successful in any type of performance reviews, right? So what you're doing well and what you could improve is the biggest one you can use. I always recommend people use it's called the 2x2 coaching framework. Always try and use that. That's much better for most people. So again, you can evaluate your entire sort of frameworks for performance reviews as well. I've mentioned this before, but in terms of legal and compliance, please stay away from making recommendations, in terms of disability accommodations. I've seen the case once of an HR rep making a comment about something not being appropriate for someone with ADHD. Please do not do that. This is inappropriate, and it can be considered illegal as well in some contexts. So, if you are not sure, just ask experts in an outsourced way, or just revert to occupational health if you really don't have any other resources. And the last thing I will cover is evaluating employee benefits. So you've heard me talk a lot about coaching and counseling. Coaching is the single biggest resource that neurodivergent people, I think, I've seen use in the last sort of 2-3 years. Because when you apply coaching frameworks and you use them with neurodiversity, that's where you can really leverage people's strengths. So sometimes, again, it can be forms of mentoring, it can be a manager, but it can be a peer. Again, there's various forms, but I would encourage you to have a look at your benefits if you're able to offer coaching for your employees. That's the best outcome, to be honest. And also, if you can cover neurodiversity diagnosis through your health provider, that's ideal. I know they do that, but if you're a smaller company, it might not be possible, but something to look into. And also consider different groups around this community. So again, I'm talking about neurodivergent folks, but there are also parents of neurodivergent kids. They have different needs, and they need to support their children in different ways. So something to really consider as well. So look at all these different groups, what they might need. It's just better to ask them directly. To be honest, they'll just tell you usually. But coaching, I think, is the single biggest resource that companies can use to ensure success, and sort of also merging successfully of all of these different neurotypes in the workplace, right?
Okay, thank you so much. And so like that's such a strong reminder that inclusion doesn't stop at having the right policies. Like, right, it really comes down to how people experience the workplace on a day-to-day basis. And one of the challenges we hear about more and more, and you've touched on this already during our conversation, is burnout. So particularly for neurodivergent employees who might be, you know, masking or constantly adapting to fit into the systems that are not necessarily designed to accommodate them. When it comes to burnout, Aurelia, what can teams and organizations do, and perhaps more from a psychological safety point of view, to prevent burnout for employees in this case?
Yeah, and this is something we need to also address, in the sense that autistic burnout or neurodivergent burnout is not the same as burnout as we know it. So, you know, burnout is a category of disorders from, you know, the workplace that we've known for, you know, many years now. And burnout can be addressed usually with rest and taking time off from work activities. So that's usually like well understood a little bit. It comes from stress and demands being higher than your capacity. So neurodivergent burnout is not the same, because it includes stress from the demands. So it means that the demands exceed the cognitive capacity or the executive functions. But it also means that there's a layer added of like sensory processing that doesn't work right, executive functioning that actually goes completely wrong. And this is tremendous, like this is a catastrophic event for someone who's neurodivergent. And I can give you an example of myself when it happened to me some years back, where I was so burned out that I lost essential executive functions. So I couldn't speak for hours on end. I forgot how to cook, you know, and I exhibited symptoms of dementia. I could not remember anything. I had like massive memory holes. Like this is catastrophic, right? As an outcome for your health. So, and this can last months to years. Like this happens to people. So obviously we want to stay away from these outcomes, and we want to give the chance to people to really have a workplace that works for them. So I want to go back to the question of accommodations. If you question people request for accommodation, this is where it starts to go wrong, right? Because then I'm using a lot of my cognitive capacity to prove my disability. It's starting to take a massive toll on me, because then there's also, you know, self-doubt and forms of medical gaslighting that comes into play, and it's starting to become very difficult to deal with. And then when you can't adapt to the workplace because people won't make changes, you just have to consistently mask and not be yourself, and you eat up more and more cognitive bandwidth. So think of it like, you know, a battery. If I have 100%, but tomorrow I start the day with 80%, and the next day 60%, and then you go on until I go into negative. And once I'm in negative, it's so hard to go back, essentially. So this is what it means to live with an invisible disability. And this applies to neurodivergent people, but also people with chronic illnesses. Right? So this is something we have to broaden our thinking around this. So burnout, usually when people tell you they're burned out, it's too late. Like already if they are telling you they're burned out, it's too late, you know. So we really need to do something beforehand. So the accommodation process is like 80% of, I know I'm repeating myself, but 80% of what you can do to prevent this is going to be around accommodations. And then I would encourage you to also have every manager that comes into your company to have neurodiversity awareness, like, you know, just do a small training online or have a small workshop amongst yourselves to just make sure that you understand the principles of leadership with neurodiversity. So if you spot some of the signs, you know, like people having memory lapses, people being consistently late or not being able to deliver, like those are signs that people are really struggling. You can really spot them and say, okay, you know, what can we do to support you? And be flexible. So it's more about people being aware of what to look for, you know, kind of like, of course, when we think about different types of diagnosis, but just having also open eyes to different types of manifestations, let's say, because an employee that has a lot of memory lapses, for example, can be mistaken for someone who's just forgetful or not paying attention, right? but it can actually be a depiction of something much deeper and much more problematic. So again, awareness is going to play a huge part, and also, believe people when they tell you what they need. Don't make them jump through like unnecessary hoops potentially as well. Act in good faith, if possible, and think that people do as well.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Aurelia. I really appreciate it. And it's such a powerful reflection, and how inclusion, well-being, compliance, it's all interlinked, right? So part of me wishes that I was on the opposite side of this webinar today, so I could sit and take my notes in my lovely handbook that I usually do. But I'm trying to take it all in and remember it all as we go along, so we should be okay. So on that note, I'd like to jump into the legal and policy frameworks that underpin all of this. So Aurelia, what legal or regulatory frameworks should organizations be aware of when they're supporting neurodivergent employees?
The main one is the Employment Equality Act, right? So I referred to this earlier. Just have a look at it. You can also ask, your in-house counsel about it, but it's a fairly straightforward document that says, those are the frameworks around disability accommodations. There are things that you should consider. So again, I would say, I'm not a lawyer, so again, I would encourage you to have a look into your own legal counsel, like legal department. But basically, from a compliance perspective, in terms of disability, you're going to have to look at how you handle the data, right? So again, this is like GDPR related, like this is special type of data when it comes to the medical information of people. So just have a look at that in your accommodations process, like who is handling this information, how it's treated, etc. So that's one of the things. And then look at the Employment Equality Act. But basically, as I've just covered before, you have an obligation to provide a reasonable accommodation once you are made aware or you become reasonably aware of someone's disability. And the only reason that you can't provide an accommodation is if it represents undue hardship on your business. So the undue hardship, again, it's up to you, the employer, to prove that it's an undue hardship, either because of lack of resources or simply because you cannot implement it because it would disrupt your business too much. But it's up to you to prove that. So those would be the two main ones. And there's one that's a little bit more subtle, I think, which is the topic of indirect discrimination. So if your processes, like for performance evaluation or your policies, are putting a group of people, so let's say in that case, disabled folks, at an unfair disadvantage, this is considered indirect discrimination. So I'll give you an example. If you say, again, I think return to office is a big one, but if you tell everyone to return to the office and there's no exception, you have created an unfair, like a disadvantage for the group that's disabled. So your policy is discriminatory in nature, essentially, because it's indirect discrimination. So something to look at, again, when you create policies or you evaluate people's performances, am I, putting a certain group at a disadvantage? This it also works for any group that's an unrepresented group, right? So if we speak about ethnic minority, if we speak about single parents, all of these groups can be unfairly discriminated against because of policies, that just would give an advantage to other groups that are more prevalent. So this is a broader question around intersectionality, but I would encourage you, when you look at your policies again or your processes, to think like, are there groups that could be negatively affected by this, just in general? Like that's an inclusivity question that you should really ask yourself as well. And again, I would like to give you an example from recent news as well. We used to think that trainings, for example, was not covered under reasonable accommodation because, again, the language is a little bit vague, unfortunately. But Capgemini, so in the UK, it's quite a big consultancy company. They were actually, they received a fine from an employment tribunal recently because they refused ADHD training, so neurodiversity training, to a group of people in the UK. And so the employment tribunal said that can be considered reasonable accommodation because this is a form of indirect discrimination that your employer doesn't know about ADHD. So basically, they said this can definitely be a reasonable accommodation. So this is something that is evolving, right? So again, I would encourage you to say, okay, maybe we haven't done this before, or this is something new to consider. Is this going to work for the company, for the groups that we're trying to support? But don't be unnecessarily inflexible, if I can say it like this.
That's very interesting. I hadn't heard about the case. And I think it's, you know, a lot of organizations operate cross-jurisdictionally. So it's a very, very useful example that you just shared with us. And I think it also shows how the legal landscape continues to evolve, right? We've seen the European Accessibility Act come into force earlier on this year as well, and how organizations are being held more and more accountable. But in the example that you shared, it also seems to be in a more meaningful way, perhaps, going forward. So not just awareness. So thank you. And I'm conscious of the time. We have about 10 minutes left, and I do see questions that have come in. So just to kind of wrap up the webinar before we get into the Q&A section, Aurelia. So we've covered the frameworks, you know, the culture, practical steps, tools, etc. We've covered a lot. So if there is one thing you'd like attendees to take away and apply tomorrow, next week in the workplaces, to make the workplaces more neuro inclusive and friendly, what would it be?
Yeah, so I've covered the topics of ERG, so employee resource group. But again, if you don't have one, I would encourage you to create one. Simply, you know, the way you can get this started is just, you know, put up a message in your message board or wherever and say, hey, we are now having a little bit of budgets to create ERGs. Who would want to take the lead on this? We'd love to support you. Again, you don't need €1 million to get started with this. You can have an ERG that has, you know, a €500 yearly budget, just to have some stickers and like a committee. It's really just important for a company to say we are supportive of, you know, different groups being established within our organization that are going to represent and advocate for underrepresented groups. Again, I'm taking the example of larger companies like Google or Microsoft, but they have ERGs for every groups, you know. And this is important because this is sort of the voice of the community that you would want to rely on. And again, when you have established ERGs, those are going to be a resource that you can use, so you don't have to outsource also this knowledge as well. Another one is, again, coming back to the attitude thing. So believe people when they tell you what they need. Very rarely, and I've never came across this actually, will someone who needs support, you know, lie about what they need just to gain something. You know, if I'm in a company and I want to do my job and I come to you for support, it's 99% chance I'm not scheming for something, you know. It's because I do need support and I just want to do my job, you know, in a sustainable way. So, you know, think that people act in good faith because it is most likely the case. And just, again, have a toolbox ready. So your toolbox can be a little training around neurodiversity that your manager can take. It's the ERG, it's the counseling or the coaching that you're able to offer. So just have different tools ready and know that it's not on you entirely to also cover all of these aspects. You know, you can ask different people, again, within your communities, or you can outsource some of that as well. But you don't have to know everything, but it is your job to sort of be informed around the resources and the support that you are able to provide.
Right, thank you so much. So I will jump into the Q&A section, and the first question we have here is, what are the main strengths of neurodivergent employees? Is it innovative thinking and problem solving?
They have many strengths. I suppose that there are people. I would say that depending on, you know, people's neurotype, like, for example, I'm only autistic, so I'm not autistic and ADHD, and I know that my strengths would be, you know, pattern recognition or extremely good, like, you know, record keeping or organizational skill. But I'm not very good at creative thinking. And that's why I work super well with people who have ADHD, because I have strengths they don't have, which might be organizational skills, but they're much better at creative problem solving. So if you put like two different neurotypes together, they can work like super well. And it's an interesting question because you can figure this out by having coaching, essentially. So there's going to be inherent strength, I think, in these neurotypes. I just don't want to have stereotypes essentially. But yeah, people who tend to have ADHD tend to be, more creative problem solvers and think about solutions that most people wouldn't think about as well. And they're usually extroverted, and they have usually external facing roles. People who might be autistic might be more internal thinkers as well, and they're very good at pattern recognition. So again, there are as many types of profiles as there are people. So, try and combine different people, and their strengths usually will shine when they actually get to leverage others as well.
Okay, thank you. Do you think that neurodivergent staff taking up accommodations may feel vulnerable in doing so?
Yeah, of course they can. It is a vulnerable thing to also tell people that you work with, potentially, even if you don't have to disclose the entire thing, but it is a vulnerable thing to talk about yourself. And again, we're talking about pretty private data. It's not like I would necessarily want everyone to know. But it's also about, and that's a great question, because it's about your attitude to it. So if you tell consistently people in your company that accommodations are just leveling the playing field, it's not a special treatment, it's not something they get because they're extra super, it is just leveling the playing field because, they have something that they need from the company that they can't achieve. So it's really up to you to reinforce the message that because you are an inclusive employer, you are more than happy to provide accommodations, to people who need it. And again, it is simply leveling the playing field. But the less we talk about it, the more we make it a really big taboo topic as well. So don't hesitate to, say the word disabled, say the word autistic, ADHD, accommodations. Those are not swear words. You shouldn't really be afraid to talk about that stuff as well.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here. It says, what about hiring practices? Would you like to touch on the hiring practices?
Yeah, a very simple answer to this one. You should just employ a company that provides accommodation for the hiring process. So there are companies like Employability. There are many other ones, but this is the one on top of my head. They will come in within the hiring process, collect the information about the accommodation, and then work with your HR department to accommodate the candidate. It means the candidate does not have to disclose to you what their disability may be or what they need from you in the process. You will hear it from Employability. So there is confidentiality that's being sort of kept in the process. And people are usually a lot more comfortable going through a third party than the employer they're trying to get a job with, because most people will not disclose during the hiring process simply because they're afraid of being discriminated against. So my advice is just hire a different company, a third party, to deal with this. It works really well, and there are people who specialize in this.
Okay, and you did touch earlier on at the start of our conversation about more Gen Z individuals identifying as, or being neurodivergent. And there's a question that has come in regarding what supports are available for autistic young people under the age of 18 years. So for the younger generation.
The question might be just generic, maybe how to enter the workforce. So I'm going to also stay on the topic of, transitioning. Like, for example, there are a lot of programs from transitioning to school, from school to work. So there are charities like As I Am. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with As I Am, who provide great employment programs. So they do workshops for younger folks, like how to craft your first resume, how to understand the type of work that you want to do, like how much work also do you want to do. So I would direct you to, if you're looking for youth resources, I would direct you to As I Am, like 100%, because they do a lot in that space. There's also other social enterprise like Aspire, the Autism Association of Ireland, so you can have a look at that. Some companies also have, like summer internship programs that are completely open to anyone who is disabled, neurodivergent. Like, I would encourage you to have a look at their website. Like Google has one, for example, as well. So just have a look at the different things. In terms of support, I would go directly to As I Am, because unfortunately, I cannot say that the government provides a ton of support. So I would go directly to a charity if you're looking for information on how to make the transition into the workplace.
Okay, thank you. And unfortunately, we won't have enough time to go through. I do see there are some more questions in the Q&A section, but perhaps Fiona might be able to take some of them offline if that's okay. I'm not entirely sure, but I would like to thank you, Aurelia, for such thoughtful insights today. It's been a great conversation. There's a lot you have given us to reflect on, to take away, to hopefully action, to turn that awareness into action in our workplaces and our lives. So I would like to close out by thanking Aurelia once again for her time today, and thank all our attendees for their engagement in today's webinar. I hope you found the webinar insightful, interesting, and I wish you all a great day, and thank you again so much again.
Thank you
Thank
both.
you.
Take care.
Thank you.